experience against what historians had been writing. And I think that's the responsible way to do a memoir, not just to say what you experienced, but how it fit into the larger pattern. I spent a whole summer in Utrecht in Holland, and I spent 9 months in Oxford. I spent time in Israel. I spent time in Germany. And I spent a lot of time to do this book exploring my own memories with my therapist. And then I began to write. My father knew I was writing the book, and he shared his attitude about it with me. My father had an attitude about everything. He did. He taught me not to benefit financially from the Holocaust, a problem with many people who are Holocaust experts and did benefit financially. He said I should donate any proceeds. So when you are buying my book later, you will see, you should know that all the proceeds from the sales of Hiding in Holland are going to a relevant organization. Right before he died in 2013, I asked Dad, what would you like me to have learned from your story? He did not say what Anne Frank did, that there is some good in everyone. He did not say that, but he said instead, there are some good people in the world. Tzaddikim. The world is supposed to be preserved because of the 36 tzaddikim that are alive and doing good deeds, and they don't even know that they are this person. So I am dedicating this talk to the many good people who saved my parents' lives at the risk of their own and for no benefit whatsoever. In fact, the people who hid my parents the longest refused to be honored as a righteous Gentile. And we badgered them for years. And they finally, so we said, why? And they said, because why should being a decent person and saving someone who is being hunted and tried to be killed for no reason, why should that person be celebrated? Isn't that the most natural thing in the world, like having breakfast? You just do it. And of course, it's not that way. And we finally convinced them to accept it, which they did, when my parents said, you have to teach the next generation. And that's what they did, and that's what I'm trying to do. Okay, now we're going to try slides. That went too fast. Okay. My father, Max Michael Rothschild, was not born in Holland. He was born in Germany. But I want to show you Holland. Do people recognize these two images? No? Which one do you recognize? The one on the left? The one on the left is Anne Frank. So if I were a person describing this statue, I would say it's a young girl on a pedestal with book bags and looking resolute, dressed properly. Is that the image we should have of Anne Frank? What happened to Anne Frank? Anne Frank was betrayed. She was betrayed by some Dutch people or person, and that's why she was killed. She was brought to the concentration or central camp in Holland. Holland had numerous concentration camps. This one was called Westerbork. And from Westerbork, she was sent to Bergen-Belsen with her sister Margot, and they both died of disease. And the only reason this happened is because they were betrayed by Dutch people. And what did Dutch people get in return for betraying a Jew? Does anyone know? 7 guilders. I don't know how much 7 guilders are because they don't use guilders anymore, they use euros. But I don't think it's more than $15. And they got a receipt. And they could take this receipt and use it as money to buy a beer or something like that. And it was very popular. So that's who she is. So when I see that statue, I see, I don't know if this is too strong a word, a lie or propaganda. This is supposed to be a message from the Dutch government that Anne Frank is a Dutch heroine who was somehow protected, but that is not the story. Also, was Anne Frank alone in her attic? She was with 7 other people. There were 8 people there altogether. Where are they? Aren't they as important as she is? What is this glorification? Is this Saint Anne? The other picture, does anyone know what that is? That's another sculpture. And what's interesting that I want you to know about the sculpture, and I want you to look critically at sculptures wherever you go to see who's missing and what message is being portrayed. I'm sorry that I'm talking to you as if you were my students. It's an occupational hazard. The red brick building behind the sculpture is the Portuguese synagogue in Amsterdam. People know about that? It was, at the time it was built, the largest synagogue in Europe. And the Portuguese people were the survivors of the Inquisition. That synagogue is so important as a landmark. I'm really happy that there's something in front of it. But what is it? If you don't know who this man is, what do you think the story is here? To me, it looks like this guy did something really great which saved the synagogue. Is that a reasonable inference? Well, it's not that at all. This is a very famous symbol of a man. It's not of a particular man. And he's called a dock worker. Dock workers are people who work the canals. And as you know, Amsterdam is full of canals. So he and his friends were disgusted by the way the Nazis who had come to Holland in 1940, the way the Nazis were treating the Jews. And he and other dock workers, working class people, not intellectuals, not religious leaders, your average guy, he created a group of people who called for a national strike. And they were successful. They had the strike. And so Jews like him, and the people of Amsterdam love him. Why? Because it conveys a very positive image of the Jews of Amsterdam, which is the image, of the non-Jews of Amsterdam, right, the dock workers, and what they did to save the Jews, and maybe even save the synagogue. But that's also not what happened. What happened was that, first of all, this was not a single man's activity. He's just one of many, right? So, and who's missing from this sculpture? A Jew. You have no idea what this is about. There's just some strong Dutch dock worker, and he gets all the glory. And what does it infer? It infers that Jews did nothing to save themselves. So the first one is the Jews somehow disappeared, meaning Anne Frank. And the second one is Jews didn't know what to do to save themselves. I think those are terrible messages. And my husband and I just came back from Amsterdam. And there's a brand new museum there. There's a new museum about the Holocaust sprouting up every year in Amsterdam. And it again gave a false message. This museum is called the Museum of the Holocaust. It has all sorts of pictures, some of which are familiar to you, some of which are not familiar to you. But the main thing that is missing, like the Jews are missing from the dock worker, and like the average Dutch person is missing from the Anne Frank sculpture, in this case, what's missing is the fact that the Dutch collaborated. So you have all these horrible things taking place to Jews, depicted in the Shoah Museum, but there's no sense of who. There is one picture in there with about 6 or 7 Dutch people, children and their parents, and they're all giving the Nazi salute. But there's no explanation about what that means in terms of the... So I would like to shake up your notion, if you have a notion, of what the relationship is between the Dutch people and the Holocaust. My father was not born in Holland. He was born in Germany, and I'm going to have another slide here. No, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to start with this first. This is, if you remember nothing from my lecture, I would like you to remember this chart. This chart, not all the numbers, I mean, just the message. So it starts with Bulgaria. I don't know if you can read that on the top. And then it shows, the next column is how many Jews were there in Bulgaria. And it says here there were 50,000. That's a lot of people. How many people were killed during the Holocaust? 7. 0. I'm sorry, I can't even see that. 0, thank you for correcting me. And that is 0%. There is a debate about this because there were 2 parts of Bulgaria, but we're not going to get into that. We just know that this occurred. Okay, next. Next one is Finland. They had 2,000, thank you, Jews, and 7 were killed. Then there's Denmark, with 60 killed out of 7,800. What does this mean? And these were all countries in which the Nazis invaded and ruled those countries, okay? There are also countries which were not invaded in Europe. Does anyone know one? Portugal. Right, and Spain, but that was a kind of a mixed thing. Switzerland, also a little mixed. But these were all countries that Germany ruled. And, but you see there's differences in percentages, even though they were ruled, right? Why is that? There are many factors, but one of them is the attitude of the people who lived there. Italy, I think they were just drinking and eating. 350,000, 76,000 were killed. That's a lot of people being killed. But it's nothing like, and that's 18.7%? No, or 21.8. And it just gets larger and larger. See the percentages being killed? And so you've got all these countries, including countries of the Eastern Europe, Hungary, Romania, Czechoslovakia, right? And then we come to the Netherlands. Why is the Netherlands down there? Why isn't it next to Denmark and Italy? Or Denmark and Finland, the other Scandinavian countries? There were 140,000, and it went down to 101,000. 72%. There are many statistical analyses of these numbers, and this might be, you might see it as 85% in some books, or 75% in some books. It's still kind of being worked out. But my contention is that when you murder 72% of the population, that's genocide. There's not enough there to create a new culture. Yehud and I went to the Portuguese synagogue in 2024, after this Holocaust, which ended in 1945. There were 10 people for Shabbat services. And I think that all the women, the 5 women, were tourists. Okay, so then you see the rest, and the worst was Poland with 89%. We all know how terrible Poland was, right? Now you should know what Holland was. So, let's see what we have next. Yeah, my father was born in 1921 in Gunzenhausen, Germany. Oh, okay. And I want to just show you where that is. Remember, he went to Holland, but he was German. And here are some places you might know. Gunzenhausen, which means the house of geese, was a rural place. And it's near Nuremberg, which is north of it, and Munich, which is south of it. It's called Bavaria. It's basically rural. And he grew up there in a deeply anti-Semitic Bavarian town. Bavaria was known as the most anti-Semitic area of Germany, because Germany had been anti-Semitic for hundreds of years. When Dad was growing up, there were 200 Jews and 5,000 non-Jews in the town, and 2 doctors. Dad's father was one of the doctors. In addition to being a very respected and busy general practitioner, he delivered most of the children of the town and took care of most of the poor people of the town, because that was his personality. And both groups, the children and the poor people, later attacked all the Jews of the town. In Gunzenhausen, all the Jews were traditional, or what we might call Orthodox. Their lives revolved around the Jewish calendar and the family and the synagogue. That was it. An imposing structure was that synagogue. This is the town in 1880, so that's 40 years before he was born. And that's the synagogue. Look how magnificent that is in a town with 200 Jews. It shows how important the synagogue was. It was the center of their life. My father describes in his writing all the holidays, how they were celebrated, and how the little rascal boyfriends of his played tricks on everybody. He loved that. So, unlike many people who have written memoirs, and this is also something to think about, many of you have read memoirs of the Holocaust, I presume. Dad was religious as a boy. Many Holocaust memoirs are written by people who were never religious. But he veered away from religion as he grew older. And then he returned to Judaism when he arrived in the United States in 1947, eventually becoming a rabbi about 15 years later. Dad had a strong Jewish identity, but he also had a strong German identity. I would say as strong as. What happened here? That's the synagogue that just wants to be back there. Richard, could you help me? That synagogue will not go away. Okay, no, that's not what I want. So it doesn't matter. Okay, I have a, there you go. This is a strong Jewish identity thing. You know what this is? This is a list of boys who had their bris around when my father's was, which was there with the purple. They had a whole book, and everything was part of a communal celebration. So he had a strong German identity, and this is his father, who was a medic in the German army, okay? Dr. Karl Rothschild in World War I. He was a humanist, meaning that he loved art and culture. He loved being here at Chautauqua. And here he is sitting in his medic station with pictures and things and reading, and developing his life. He served in the army as a medic, and he was very proud of the fact that when there were Russian soldiers whom the Germans were fighting and they became injured, he would also help them. Dad loved the German language. I grew up in the United States in a German-speaking household. He loved making jokes in German and playing with the language. He loved German music, couldn't get enough of it, and German poetry, which he recited. He loved the landscape of Germany. He loved German kosher cuisine. He was truly a German kid, in addition to being a Jewish kid. He was an excellent student, even skipping a grade of elementary school. His Jewish education began when he was 3 years old and had a private tutor. By the time he entered kindergarten, I think he could read the whole Torah. When World War I ended, Karl Kalonimus Rothschild, his father, married the beautiful Tekla Katzenstein, with whom he had 4 children in rapid succession, 3 of whom survived and 1 of them died in childhood accident. When Tekla was in her mid-30s, she died at home of heart disease. My father always said, I'm so glad she died then. Her parting words to her son was, "Survive." Little Max did not know what she meant, but he remembered her saying that and tried to live by that. Tekla was buried in Gunzenhausen, and when her husband Karl thought of leaving Germany because of Nazism, he couldn't do it because he could not leave Tekla's gravestone behind. And that gravestone has a history of its own. It doesn't exist. Oh, here's the 3 children. Her gravestone is the black one. It was completely vandalized. The place is empty. And we don't know where exactly the grave was. There's no indentation. And because of that, the Jewish authority in Nuremberg, which is not so far away as I showed you, won't let us put up another gravestone because we don't know where that is. As a young child in Gunzenhausen, Dad was ridiculed, spat upon, and forced to memorize the Nazi interpretation of history with its overwhelming Jew hatred. He had to memorize that and be tested on the way Nazis defined history. Adolf Hitler was obsessed with educating German children, which he understood to be the future. The German school system was completely Nazified. The teachers had to take training in Nazi theory. And when my father was in hiding and couldn't get outside for 3 years, he wrote a lot about the fact that the Nazi teachers were partially really responsible for the rise of Nazi soldiers because of how they taught them. When Dad was 12 in 1933 and Hitler had become the Chancellor of Germany, Dad unwittingly embarked, and please remember this, on what was to be his first resistance operation. Remember I told you that this is a book about resistance. His intent was to counteract the Jewish passivity he saw around him in Gunzenhausen, including that of his father. They all sort of tried to accommodate to it. His resistance was against 2 issues, and he was only a bar mitzvah boy. Number 1, he resisted the norms of the Jewish community, the way they were acting, and he resisted German lies. Specifically with his friends, what did he do to resist? He didn't blow up a train. He created a Jewish Zionist boys club that built an outdoor sports facility and showed that Jews were strong and athletic and that they were nothing like the Nazi image that was being perpetrated. He wrote, "It is important to understand this episode of creating a Zionist youth group as an early act of resistance because, to me, it represented departing from the role of weakling and victim. It was a positive, non-violent form of resistance." You should think about what is positive, non-violent resistance. There was a movie shown here the other day about resistance, and I think it was all armed. Thank you for correcting me. I didn't see it. What I saw was a few clips. And then he wrote, "We club members did not endanger ourselves. That was to come in high school." In other words, there was no cost to doing this. I had encountered so much persecution in Gunzenhausen that shortly after my bar mitzvah, Dad arranged for me to move to Munich, which, as a large cosmopolitan city, Dad thought, his father thought, would be safer than prejudiced backward Gunzenhausen, but of course it wasn't. In fact, Munich, where his father sent him to save him, was the epicenter of the Nazi Party at that time. And so this, as a sociologist, I say, internal migration within Germany, to go from Gunzenhausen to Munich, let's say, rarely helped. The only thing that helped was external migration. You had to get out of there. Hiding in Holland, the book, describes my father's life as a teenager in Munich. There he joined Habonim. Habonim is a Zionist youth organization. Its purpose was to prepare youngsters to make aliyah to Palestine and become farmers and kibbutz members. In this group, Dad fell in love. He was only about 14, but I understand. With Ilse Herta Strauss, a girl his age, whom he would marry many years later. Dad understood his entire involvement in the Zionist youth group as an act of resistance against ideology of the Nazis, which claimed that Jews were lower than insects. He said that what Habonim did at that time was create an alternative view of the world, right? Where you were great because you were a Jewish kid, where you could achieve anything, where we could achieve a country of our own. A completely different image of what a Jew was than what the Nazis were saying, and which was pervasive. Dad's next act of resistance was his unwillingness to translate passages of Mein Kampf, Hitler's book, My Struggle, from German to English, which was part of his graduation exam. You see what I mean? It's always embedded. And that exam is called the Abitur. And the actual passage that he had to translate from German to English was about the fact that Jews did not serve at all in World War I, which is, of course, untrue. In fact, his uncle, my grandfather's brother, died as a young soldier, 18 years old, for Germany. My father was banned from graduating with his class and despised for bringing down the class average. Next, Dad moved to the Zionist work farm. This was right after graduation, far away in Upper Silesia, as did my mother, Elsa Strauss. Their dad made a dear friend. His name is Joachim Simon, whom everyone called Shushu, and who was really largely remembered. He was a teenager, a little bit older than my father, who would play a decisive role in my father's life. Habonim created a youth society where people relied on each other rather than on adults. Dad was working on the farm on November 9th, 1938. What's that date? Kristallnacht. He was working on the farm when Kristallnacht erupted. Thugs from surrounding areas around the farm forcibly removed him and all the boys in the farm, were 100 approximately, and sent the girls home after terrorizing them and mocking them and touching their breasts and stealing their tampons and putting them on their head. After a long journey in an open truck, the boys were deported to the Buchenwald concentration camp. He was 17. The camp was in Germany, and there he was tortured. Nevertheless, he continued resisting. He didn't have any arms to resist. He resisted with his spirit, his mind. He deceived his captors. He feigned ignorance, and any other trick that he could come up with, he did. And it is very important to me that you understand that camps were filled with people engaged in unarmed resistance. They didn't succeed necessarily, but that's what they tried to do. They did not go like sheep. My father's experience and documentation redefined resistance, as I have said several times. When the war was over, Dad went to several organizations and asked them if they would certify that he was in the resistance, and they all did. My grandfather married this woman, Henrietta Tuch, after Tekla died, and she's still there. Can you help me, Richard? He moved to Munich, we did that, moved to Elgus, that's where the farm was. Am I doing something wrong? Oh, and here's Shushu. Shushu was a prophet. Here's Shushu. He's sitting in a circle, but can you see the energy that emanates from his face? He was the leader of the group. And this is Buchenwald, right after 1938. And what do you see there? You see huge numbers of people, and they all look the same, don't they? Why? Because all their defining characteristics were removed. Their hair, their clothes, their expression, because they were all terrified. And they had to stand there for long periods of time. In January 1939, my father got out of Buchenwald. And the reason he got out of Buchenwald, there are many reasons, but one that I think is really interesting, is that the Germans got a lot of people, a lot of Jews into Buchenwald, and then they released them so that you could get more Jews to go into Buchenwald, and then release them. And the idea was to terrorize the Jewish population by getting everybody into the camp. Well, not everybody, but. And then after a couple of years, women were also brought there. So Dad because of Dad's Zionist organization membership, he was able to be invited to come to Holland as a farm hand and to learn more farming skills, which Halunim was going to give him. He was there, but it was like jumping out of the fire pan into the fire, because after he was there for 1.5 years, so-called learning farming skills, which he didn't learn anything because they just used him as cheap labor. Painting buildings, which as far as I know is not a farming skill. But a year and a half later, the Germans violated their agreement with Holland and invaded. This was May 1940. May 10th, 1940 precisely. And the reason I know the date is that Richard, what's happening? Okay, so the reason I know the date was because my father had obtained tickets to go to the United States on May 11th, 1940. But the Nazis invaded the day before, and he was stuck for 5 years under the Nazis. So here we have Holland. Germany is on the east of it. Belgium is on the south. And that town, Almelo, do you see that? That's where he was a farmer. And Amsterdam is much closer to the west, and Rotterdam is to the south. Those are the main places. Of course, I shouldn't say that. Also down south, which is where eventually the Allies came up here and were stuck there at Arnhem for an extra 9 months until they could move forward and liberate. Do you know that Rotterdam and Amsterdam were the two last places in Europe that were liberated? And they had a winter before they were liberated in May 1945. And the winter before that, that is from around November to May, they were starved by the Nazis. Starvation of other populations is not uncommon in the history of warfare. The Russians did it to the Ukrainians, and the Germans did it to the Dutch. So my father benefited a lot when he got to Holland by being in Almelo, because he was on the farm by himself. This was a Dutch farm, pictures that Van Gogh made, these peasants. And when he was on that farm, there was no one who spoke German. So he had to speak Dutch. And that ultimately saved his life too. They were Jews who were not hidden, but they were housed together with other Jews on other farms. But he was alone, and he spoke German. He spoke Dutch. Of course, he also spoke German. And he also met a lot of people, and those people whom he met and with whom he could speak in Dutch became the people who saved his life, the good Gentiles. From the day he arrived in Holland, my father had to have a pass. And people have to have passes. I mean, when do we show our identity cards? We show them when we go into the airport. When else? I don't know. Maybe to come into Chautauqua. I don't know. But it's not a common thing to have to identify who you are. But in Holland, people had to identify themselves all the time, and all the Jews were identified as Jews. And my father is Max Israel Rothschild here, and he's allowed to stay a certain amount of time. And you have to pay for the pass. So with these passes, the Germans could keep close tabs on the Jews. So my father he was disgusted by the fact that he couldn't learn anything, and so he asked the people who had given him the placement, could I go to Amsterdam? And could I learn to be an auto mechanic? He thought maybe he could learn something. And he went there and is exploited once again, totally exploited. He was a step and fetch it, that kind of person. Get me a cup of coffee, fine. That's how you learn auto mechanics. And these were just regular Dutch people who were doing that because they recognized people who were powerless. And he really was disgusted by what happened and what he saw in the streets of Amsterdam, attacks on Jews. Then he went back to Almelo. And I wanted to tell you now what happened in Almelo, because it was one of the most important things that ever happened to him. His friend Shushu, whom I introduced you to before, right? They were in Buchenwald together, they were in the farm together in Germany, and then they were close friends in Holland. Shushu was even more active than my father. Shushu went all around Holland trying to find out what is going on in this country. Is it safe? What should we do? He was like a scout. And he figured out what should happen, and he came to Almo to tell his good friend, my father, what he should do. And he said, they are going to try to kill every one of us. And no one had that notion, no one had that idea. So he said, my father said, so what should I do? He said, you should hide. Hide? This was not a well-known activity or a solution. But he said, you're going to get in the mail a little letter that says you have to report tomorrow, whenever that tomorrow is, to a special collection point, and from there you're going to go by train to the east to work on the harvest in the countries of the east, Germany, Poland, etc. And Shushu said, don't believe it for a minute. I went and spied on those collection places, and I know what the correspondence is that's going on between the various Nazi officials. You're going to be sent to a concentration camp and then to be killed. This was not in anybody's mind. Nobody could conceive of such a thing. So my father said, okay, I will do it, and I will save myself. Shushu convinced my father again to resist. Resist meaning not to obey the Germans. That was in 42, in the summer of 42. And it turns out that survival statistics show that although many Jews were killed and were found and were arrested in hiding, such as Anne Frank, it was still the best way to survive. More people survived by hiding than any other means, except getting out of the country, which nobody could do. So for 3 years, From August 1942 until May 1945, my father hid. Now, how do you hide? What do you do? If I wanted to hide in Chicago, what would I do? In a way that no one could find me. It's really difficult, very difficult. And what you first have to realize is you can't hide alone. You have to have a community. You have to have a village outside of the hiding place supporting you inside it by paying the people who are hiding you, by bringing you food, by bringing you books, by getting you medicine, whatever it is. You can't just be there alone and hide. It doesn't work. So, fortunately, my father could speak Dutch, as I told you, and he knew some people, and so he found people who would help him. The first person to help him was a guy who was himself a criminal. He was a smuggler. You see, I showed you before, the border was so close. This is when they were on the farm, my mother and my father. That's what they looked like when they were in Holland. And that's the J for Juden, or Jude. And this is a special pass that was forged that allowed my father not to be engaged in physical hard labor. Now, I don't have any pictures of, I want to get back. I don't have any pictures of my father in hiding. Why? He was not supposed to exist. The only pictures I've ever seen of people in hiding were reconstructions, recreations after the war, and you can see them in some of the museums. But, so he was in hiding. The smuggler hid with him in a haystack, which is where the smuggler always hid, but for other purposes. But on the farm that had that haystack where the smuggler hid, there was a farmer who said, I see that little guy over there. It wasn't little, he means it was so far away. He looks Jewish to me. And so the farmer who had allowed the smuggler to stay on the farm because he gave him some of his profits, right? Everything is a transaction. He said, you have to leave. So they left. The next place he went to with another helper was to a brothel. He was not told it was a brothel, but he discovered that easily and didn't take advantage of those services. But he stayed there for a while until that became too dangerous because there were always these men and women coming in all the time, right? Who said sure with such knowledge? Then he hid in an attic. And this attic, which was a more common place to hide, had a guy already hiding in there. And that was actually someone my father knew. And there was such secrecy around hiding that neither of them had ever told the other that they were there. But the problem with this guy was my father didn't like him. And that guy didn't like my father. So they had a very hard time, and they only had one bed. And my father talked about how horrible that was to sleep in the bed. First of all, with another guy, because he was not homosexual, but second of all, with a guy you don't like. And so that was a really hard time. I never understood why they didn't rotate the bed. You know, they didn't figure that out. Or if they did and it didn't work, I don't know. So eventually, after many, many other moves, my father went to Rotterdam and found righteous Gentiles who helped him. I shouldn't say he found them, somebody else found them. And that's the person who I told you before became honored as a righteous Gentile in Israel. So he was there, and then he said to them, which is chutzpah, you know that word? It was chutzpah. He says, you know, I'm here and I love being with you, etc. Could I bring my girlfriend? You know, it's hard enough to hide somebody, but they said, of course, because that's the kind of people they were. They understood the importance of love for survival. So he eventually was in many middle-class homes, and then he found through this man who hid him a place that just my mother and father could be in alone, a little tiny house. And one day, that little tiny house, again, they were still in hiding. Understand that the only time my father saw the light of day was when he was moving to another place. And they had to take the star off, and then put it back on. It was terrible. But one day their house was raided. Those were called actions, where the Nazis would come, knock on the door, barge in, which is what happened with Anne Frank, and my mother saved the day. My mother saved the day by pretending to be a German non-Jew, and my father saved himself by running down into the attic of this little house, into the basement of this little house. There was a hearth on the first floor, and then the hearth has holes in it for the ashes to go down. So the ashes went into the basement. He rolled in the ashes till he was black, and he swished himself as close as he could to the wall, and he was not seen. And he said he didn't breathe, but he also didn't sneeze, he didn't cough, he didn't make a sound. He was able to do that. So my mother said that she is a nurse, and she's taking care of the old people who live in this house, and they are on a brief vacation, and so she's just taking care of the house until they come back. And then the Germans accepted it because she had dyed her hair. Her hair was black, and she had dyed it blonde, and she spoke German perfectly, right, because she was a German girl. And when at the last minute, when the guys were finally convinced, the Germans, that my mother was telling the truth, they extended their hand to her, but she did not take it. Why did she not take it? It was a Nazi. She couldn't touch the guy. It was a visceral reaction. And then they turned to her and they said, "What is this?" Because they interpret this as a kind of disdain. And she says, I'm just afraid. They said, "Oh, we are not like those other Nazis that molest girls. You have nothing to worry about." It was a miracle. It was a miracle that happened. But she did it, and that's resisting as well. She did it. And my mother was not known as a brave person, but she was a brave person when push came to shove. So I just want to say that the northern and western sections of the Netherlands were the last areas in Europe to be liberated, and that liberation came in 1945. And then we have the post-war period. What happened in the post-war period? Did everyone come out of hiding, and all the righteous Gentiles come out and say, "We did this great thing," and all the Dutch say, "I'm so glad you're here, now would you like to have your house back?" Did all those let's say, humane things happen? Not a one. The Dutch were not happy that there was only 5,000 of the 140,000 who had been in concentration camps who came back. 5. And of the 25,000 who were in hiding, 8,000 were saved, and the other were not. So there was nobody. There was nobody. But my parents said, my father actually wrote, that the post-war period was worse than the Holocaust itself. I think the reason was that he saw what human beings are like. The other ones, the Nazis, they had this whole ideology, they had uniforms, they were told what to do. But these were just people like you and me. And they were unhelpful, as was the Dutch government. The Dutch government is a monarchy, did you know that? And there's a queen. Queen Wilhelmina was the queen during the Holocaust. And what did she do on day 2 of the German invasion? Flee to England with her cabinet. And while she was there, she did 0 for the Jews of her country. My father said if she had only said, because they risked their lives to listen to the BBC, you must have heard that, sitting huddling around the radio to hear what's going on in the world, and she says nothing about the Jews as if they don't exist. She was an anti-Semite. And I have really tried to find evidence that that's not true. There isn't any, because we have all of the speeches that she gave on the BBC. One of the things I want to show you next, this is the grave of Joachim Simon. It's not the grave of Joachim Simon. That's Shushu, and Shushu did not survive. The guy who saved so many people's lives, he did not survive. And the reason was, he was caught when he was doing all this scouting, and he was brought into a prison. And in that prison, there was let's call him a stupid guard. And the guard told him, "You're going to be interrogated this afternoon." He knew that interrogated meant tortured. So he said, "Oh my God, I'm going to be interrogated this afternoon. I have to look my best." And he said to the warden or guard, he said, "Please bring me shampoo, a razor blade, and a comb." The shampoo, he wants to do his hair, a comb to comb it, and a blade to slit his wrists. And he slit his wrists because he knew too much. And he was afraid that he would not be able to withstand torture. So he died, and Yehuda and I went to the town in which the prison was. No one there knew where the Jewish cemetery was. This was in 2020 or something. But I found somebody who knew where it was, and they sent us this picture. And my father we found in the archive of that town the eulogy that my father gave. I was so moved by that. In Hebrew, to the people who had gathered for that talk. And there are many memorials to Shushu in Israel. So my parents had a hard time in post-war Holland, and why was there a hard time? The people of Holland believe in bureaucracy, and they actually did this. When people came back from the camps, those 5,000 people, to their homes, someone came to them and said, "You have to pay the taxes you haven't paid in 5 years on this home." And all sorts of completely unhelpful activities. So to end this, I want to say that my father had many, many goals. He saved children, who were hidden with other people, and got those children out of those homes. He married his girlfriend, my mother, and that was extremely difficult because he was 26, my mother was 27, and they said, "You cannot get married unless you are 30 years old." Where this comes from, so they had to work around that. And he also had another goal. He wanted to kill a Nazi. So how would you do that? It's after the war. There's a lot of Nazis around, all of Germany and all of Holland, basically. Holland had the largest Nazi party in all of Europe. So how did he do it? He went back to the town in which he was born, Gunzenhausen, and he had a gun. And he walked around the town, and he said, "I remember him. I'll kill him. No, that one, he was worse. No, that one." And there was too many, and it was senseless. It was senseless, and it was unlawful, obviously. And so he didn't do it, and he feels good about not having done it, of course. He resisted killing. Very good, thank you. I'll add that to my next talk. So he couldn't carry that out. But he did carry out marrying my mother. And my mother gave birth to me. And that was on June 17th, 1946. The war was over in May 1945. What do you think that I meant to them, even before I developed as a person? A miracle. Like they say in Hanukkah, Nes Gadol Hayasham, there was a great child. For a couple who have gone through what they've done, they were nearly starved to death, honestly. They were nearly killed so many times. And here's a child. The next generation. And that's what I grew up being, this special person who had this burden of telling you the story of what happened to my parents. The last thing he did before he finally got a visa to the United States, and if I tell you that the Germans were bad to the United States, and to the Jews, and the Dutch were bad to the Jews, what do you think the Americans were? You've all seen, I think, evidence of that. And my father loved America when he came here finally, and he would, Yehuda knows this, he would always take us, my father, on road trips all over the place wherever we lived. Not necessarily very far, but just to see what is America like. And we usually went to places where there were lots of trees, and lots of fields, and lots of emptiness. And he would always say, but there wasn't enough room for Jews. I can't drive around like this anymore. You know, it is so imprinted in my head. I always tell Yehuda, let's get out of here, because there's no place for the Jews. Of course, there's so much place for the Jews. And they would have done a great thing for this economy if they had been saved. My father ended his life ended his stay in Holland by going to the World Zionist Congress, which was started by Theodor Herzl in 1897, and this was December 1946, after I was born, 6 months later. And he noted what was going on at the Congress and reported it. And he became a writer and a reporter. And if you read that, you also get sick to your stomach, because all the things that they were saying at that conference, they were all what would you call those things? Conclusions and petitions to the British government, which was in control of Palestine, to let the Jews come in. All the Jews that were part of that 72%, that would have gone to Palestine if you would have given them a chance. Only a few thousand, were able eventually to go. So he has, and I think about that now today, the difficulties of getting this word out into international bodies. I want to end by just showing you some more because it's too late. To continue, this is if I can find, these are the righteous Gentiles. That's Nick and Ach Schouten. They were 90 at that time. And this is the telegram that was sent to my grandparents who were in the United States already. And he writes, somebody else wrote it on his behalf, Max Rothschild and fiancé well. And that gave my grandparents the information that my parents were alive. This is from one of the French resistance organizations, and it says that he was in the resistance, and he used that to prove that he was not a German Nazi. And it says, Je jure de lutter jusqu'à l'écrasement total de l'Allemagne nazie. It means, I swear to fight until the total erasure of the German Nazis for l'honneur, for honor, for liberty, and for the right, et le droit, à la vie de Judaism, for the right to live as a Jew. And I think that would be an appropriate place to end. Thank you very much. Yes. So if you would, I will go there. I'll grab the microphone. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Tomorrow afternoon at 12:30, Shula will be back to talk about a book, 100 Jewish Brides. Thank you very much.